Don't use your ugly body to seduce my husband. Clean up the floor and get out of here.
Mrs. Whitmore, we'll handle this immediately. Your pay will cover the incident.
She swallowed the humiliation and dared not talk back because her son's hospital bill was waiting at home.
Arthur, she ruined the dinner.
No. 5 years ago, she saved my life.
Sir, I don't understand.
Red wine dripped from Naomi Hayes' chin to the collar of her white shirt, soaking through the thin, starched fabric and onto the wool rug in the private dining room overlooking Seattle Bay. The crystal glass had shattered into many pieces under the chandelier light, mixed with the trace of expensive wine like bloods spreading on the snow. Naomi fell to her knees as if by instinct of work, one hand still holding the quivering silver tray, the other scooping up the large pieces of glass before anyone stepped on them. A tiny sliver sliced her palm. Blood appeared, ran along the lines of her hand, and dripped right where the wine was going into the rug. 20 VIP guests stood around the room. No one stepped forward. One woman gently lifted the hem of her silk dress to keep it away from the wine. A man pulled his chair back a few inches, his face tightening as if he feared his Italian leather shoes might get dirty. A few people looked at one another, waiting to see how the manager would handle it, but that look was not for Naomi. It was for the rug, the spilled bottle, and the small inconvenience that had entered the smooth evening of people who were used to having others clean everything beneath their feet. The piano in the corner kept playing, slowing only for one beat when the pianist looked up and then lowered his head back to the keys. Clara Whitmore stood not far from Naomi, dry and untouched in a champagne-colored satin dress. The wine had been thrown by Clara herself after the serving tray lightly touched the edge of a chair when a guest turned too quickly. But Clara did not look at that guest. She looked at Naomi, at the wine stain on the uniform, then at the white rug with the expression of someone who had just seen an employee ruin a wedding day photograph. The new diamond wedding ring on Clara's hand caught the chandelier light, shining coldly like a piece of ice. Naomi lowered her head even more. The smell of wine mixed with expensive perfume, leather chairs, and roast beef filled the long table. She tried to pick up the glass quickly, but the blood on her fingers made the broken pieces slippery. The wine-wet collar rubbed against her skin, cold and sticky. She did not dare wipe her face, did not dare stand up, did not dare look at anyone for too long. In rooms like this, a poor female server learns that her existence is only accepted when it makes no sound. Mr. Keller, the restaurant manager, rushed in from the side door with a white towel over his arm. He looked at the wine stain the way someone looks at damage to restaurant property, then immediately turned to Clara. His back bent slightly, both hands lifting the towel as if offering an apology. Naomi looked up, waiting for a question about her bleeding hand, but that question never came. Mr. Keller only apologized to Clara for the incident affecting the private dinner of the Whitmores, promised that the restaurant would handle it right away, and then turned back to Naomi with the look of a man searching for a weaker body to place the cost on. Her evening wages were held back on the spot. Mr. Keller said it quietly enough not to ruin the mood, but clearly enough for Naomi to hear every word. He entered it into the management tablet like a normal office task, his finger choosing her name, selecting the service incident, then selecting a temporary deduction. All of Naomi's labor that night, from polishing silver glasses to kneeling on the floor picking up glass, was turned into one cold line of lost pay. Naomi pressed her lips together. Blood was still coming from her hand, but what made her dizzy was the image of Sam's hearing aid lying on the kitchen table that morning. The plastic case was scratched, and the new battery still had not stopped the sharp static in the boy's ear. Sam was 7 years old, small for his age, and he often sat near the window so he could read the lips of people walking across the apartment courtyard. That morning, when the hearing aid made a high-pitched screech, he had held his head, winced, then forced himself to smile so his mother would not worry. His teacher called during lunch break and said Sam needed a new device, one good enough for him to keep up in class. $3,000. To the people in the banquet room, that might be the price of one bottle of wine. To Naomi, it was the sound of her son. Near the glass doors overlooking the city, Arthur Whitmore stood still. He wore a black tuxedo, his white collar clean, his face so calm that others could not guess what he was thinking. Tonight was the private dinner after the wedding, where Clara wanted to introduce herself as an official part of the Whitmore family in front of financiers and investors. Arthur had married her less than 48 hours ago. He knew the room was waiting for his reaction, a nod to protect his wife, a signal that would turn Naomi into a small mistake to be swept away. But Arthur did not look at the rug first. He looked at Naomi's hand, at the way she hid the wound behind the silver tray, at her bent shoulders as she calculated every consequence of standing up too quickly. He saw Mr. Keller entering the deduction on the tablet. He saw Clara smiling very slightly, pleased that her power was working exactly the way she wanted. Arthur stepped away from the glass doors slowly, making the whole room hold its breath. Naomi noticed his shadow over her while she was still kneeling. She hurried to collect the last pieces of glass into the tray, her palm burning. She thought she was about to be told to leave the room, maybe let out the back door by security, maybe even lose the job at the event company that had only agreed to give her night shifts with hesitation. But Arthur did not signal security. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a white silk handkerchief, and lowered himself to one knee right on the rug the wine had stained. The room stopped. Arthur carefully lifted Naomi's injured hand and wrapped the silk handkerchief around the cut, pulling the edge tight enough to stop the bleeding but not enough to hurt her more. Blood soaked through the white fabric in a blurry red stain. Naomi sat stiffly, as if public kindness frightened her even more than humiliation, because it instantly made every eye turn toward her. A guest near the wine table lowered his glass. Mr. Keller stood frozen with the tablet in his hand. Clara stared at her husband kneeling on the dirty rug, her lips pressed tight because she felt her power being blurred in front of the crowd. Arthur tied the handkerchief, then his eyes stopped on the old plastic badge pinned to Naomi's apron. The badge was faded, its edge cracked, and the plastic surface so scratched that the small photo was almost impossible to see. But the words were still there. St. Jude Hospital volunteer. Arthur's throat tightened. He had looked at those words in dozens of blurry camera copies. He had asked the hospital about every volunteer on duty 5 years earlier. The person he had been searching for was not in any complete file. She was kneeling in front of him, bleeding through his handkerchief, wine on her collar, in the middle of a room that had just watched her be crushed. Memory hit Arthur without warning. 5 years ago, South Seattle had been buried in cold rain and weak streetlights. He was lying in an alley behind an abandoned warehouse, his shirt stuck to the stab wound in his side. His broken phone lay a few steps away from his hand. The men who had been hired had already left, leaving him in dirty water, beer cans, and metal trash bins. He had once signed contracts that shook entire markets, but that night, no signature could call an ambulance. A sedan drove past the mouth of the alley. He tried to lift his hand. It did not stop. It only splashed dirty water into his face and disappeared. Then a pregnant woman appeared. Her wool coat was soaked, her belly large under old fabric, her St. Jude badge swinging against her chest as she knelt and pressed her hands onto his wound. The 911 operator said an ambulance could not get into the flooded area for at least 40 minutes. That woman looked at the alley, looked at the blood on her hands, then ran into the street and stopped a taxi. The driver refused when he saw Arthur bleeding. She pulled a cash envelope from her coat pocket and pushed all of it into the driver's hand. It was her rent money. Arthur heard those words in fragments before losing consciousness. He woke after surgery to the broken story told by a doctor. The pregnant woman had paid the initial money in small cash bills, signed a few forms as a familiar St. Jude volunteer, sat in the hallway until the operating room lights went off, then left at 4 a.m. No full address, no working phone number. The camera had recorded her badly because the rain had covered the lens. Arthur had people search for months. They looked through volunteer lists, hospital files, and apartment buildings on the south side of the city. All they found were empty addresses. Back in the banquet room, Naomi lowered her head and tried to pull her hand back, but Arthur still held it very lightly, as if he were afraid that if he let go, 5 years of searching would slip away from him again. Clara stood behind him. The irritation on her face changed into confusion. She was used to Arthur being silent and allowing everything around him to move according to the order of money. But this silence was different. It was not standing with her. It was turning away from her in front of every person she needed to impress. Arthur stood. He signaled for the restaurant's medical staff, then took the silver tray from Naomi's hand and placed it on a nearby table. Naomi tried to keep herself upright, but her knees shook after so many minutes on the floor. Mr. Killer stepped forward, trying to take back control, his mouth already preparing the next apology for Clara. Arthur only had to look at him once, and he fell silent, the tablet lowering to his side. In that room, power had changed direction without anyone announcing it. Arthur looked at Clara's hand on his sleeve, then at the wedding ring he had worn for less than 2 days, then at the red wine stain on Naomi's apron. The terms in the prenuptial agreement moved through his mind like cold lines on paper: adultery, financial fraud, behavior damaging to reputation, and abuse of staff under authority during an event funded by the family foundation. Clara did not know Arthur already had more than a wine incident in his hands. She also did not know that her public act of humiliation had just placed the final piece into a file already waiting on his lawyer's desk. Arthur bent close to Clara and spoke very quietly. Naomi only caught a few broken words, but Clara's face changed enough for the whole room to see. Her smile disappeared, her chin lowered slightly. Her fingers slipped away from Arthur's sleeve as if she had touched hot metal. Arthur did not need to repeat himself. The server in front of them was the woman who had pulled him back from death 5 years ago. And Clara, through her own arrogance, had just triggered the divorce clause that would send her away with nothing. Naomi did not see any victory. She saw her hand wrapped in the silk handkerchief of a man whose face she did not remember. She saw the name St. Jude on the old badge, pulling a past she had tried to bury into the middle of this wealthy room. She saw Arthur looking at her like a man who had found a lost piece of his life, while all she wanted was to go home and check if Sam had taken off his hearing aid because of the static again. She did not know what a divorce clause was, did not know what Clara had lost, and had no idea why a billionaire spoke about a night 5 years ago with eyes that looked close to breaking. Arthur turned back to her. He did not ask her to thank him. He did not hand her money. He did not turn her into a charity story in front of the guests. He only signaled for the medical staff to come closer and stood between Naomi and Clara, as if, for the first time that evening, her body was allowed to have a boundary. When the medical worker opened the first aid kit, Naomi sat down on the nearest chair. Blood still leaked through the handkerchief, and wine still soaked her shirt, but what made her feel coldest was the memory opening inside Arthur's mind. The chandelier lights above reflected in his eyes, then slowly turned into the emergency lights of St. Jude. The wool rug under his feet turned into wet concrete. The sound of knives and forks, piano notes, and guest whispers all pulled backward behind the sound of rain hitting metal trash bins in South Seattle. 5 years earlier, Arthur Whitmore had lived because a woman used her rent money to buy him a taxi ride to the hospital. And what he had never known was that the very next night, that same woman had been pushed out of the last warm rented room she had, carrying a 7-month pregnancy and a future about to shatter in the cold snow. 5 years ago, South Seattle was buried in a snowstorm so thick that the traffic signs on 4th Avenue were only blurred patches of light behind the cold rain. Arthur Whitmore was not yet the name printed on the cover of finance magazines, but he was already rich enough for someone to want him gone. That evening, he left a private meeting with investors near the port, carrying files about a hospital deal that had been manipulated. His private car never showed up at the meeting point. His phone lost signal. A black SUV rolled in from the end of the street, and before Arthur understood he had been led into a trap, 2 men had forced him into the alley behind an abandoned warehouse. Everything happened fast, dirtier than any corporate fight. A hard blow threw him back against the brick wall. The leather briefcase was ripped from his shoulder. A sharp pain burst open in his left side, deep and cold enough that Arthur could not even make a sound. When the SUV backed out of the alley, its tires crushed his phone. The red taillights disappeared through the rain, leaving Arthur on the flooded concrete, one hand pressed hard against his side. The alley sat between an empty, cold storage building and a loading yard that had shut down after 9 p.m. Rainwater carried engine oil, scraps of paper, and the smell of wet trash around Arthur's body. The dark liquid from his shirt mixed with the black water, spreading into thin lines that ran toward the drain. That night, no one knew he was lying there. No secretary, no guard, no lawyer, a silver sedan drove past the mouth of the alley. Arthur tried to lift his hand, but his arm only slid on the concrete. The car did not slow down. Its tires splashed dirty water into his face, cold and metallic smelling. After the sedan came a pickup truck, then an empty taxi. Headlights swept across Arthur's face, but the driver only turned the wheel to avoid a pothole and kept going. Maybe they were afraid of trouble. Maybe they thought he was drunk. Arthur no longer had enough strength to be angry. He pressed his hand to his side and felt the last warmth pulling away through his fingers as his body began to grow cold from the inside. Every breath made his left ribs jerk like they were caught in a press. He tried to think of the people who could save him if he only had one phone call. But the phone was crushed under a tire, and the numbers in his head slowly fell out of order. Near midnight, Naomi Hayes turned onto that street after finishing a cleaning job at a dental office in Beacon Hill. She was 7 months pregnant, her belly large under a brown wool coat worn thin at the elbows. Her slip-resistant shoes were soaked through. In the inside pocket of her coat was an envelope with $800 in cash, the pay from many weeks of cleaning, enough to cover the overdue room rent the next morning. She had counted the envelope 3 times in the office break room, then clipped the landlord's payment reminder to it. In the corner of her pocket was her St. Jude volunteer card, because she used to help in the emergency area on weekends. Naomi did not see Arthur right away. She heard the faint scrape of a shoe on concrete, then a choked sound like someone trying to swallow air. She stopped at the mouth of the alley, one hand on her belly by habit, her eyes narrowing through the rain. When the streetlight flickered on, she saw a man lying on his side beside a metal trash bin, his shirt dark at the ribs. A pregnant woman living alone in a cheap rented room was not taught to rush into every danger. She had heard enough stories about robbery traps, about people pretending to be hurt to lure others into alleys. But Arthur moved his hand, just a little, like someone trying to hold on to his own life. Naomi stepped into the alley. She knelt beside him and immediately saw that his condition was far worse than a drunk man or someone who had fallen. She was not a doctor, but she understood he could not wait. She called 911 with her old flip phone. Rainwater covered the screen, the number keys stuck under her shaking fingers, but the call still went through. Naomi answered in a rushed but clear voice, her eyes never leaving Arthur's face. When the operator said an ambulance would have trouble reaching the flooded area and would take at least 40 minutes, Naomi looked at the water moving around his body, then looked back at the street behind her. She took off her wool coat and covered Arthur with it. Rain immediately soaked through her thin t-shirt, cold clinging to her back and belly, but she used both hands to press hard against his side to keep him conscious. Arthur opened his eyes for a few seconds. He could not see her face clearly. He only saw a plastic badge swinging against her chest and hands much smaller than his, trying to hold the fragile life left inside his body. Naomi did not ask who he was. She did not look for his wallet and did not call the press. She only bent down to listen to his fading breath, then decided that 40 minutes was too long. She did not know that this choice would take away the last roof she had before sunrise, but she still did not pull her hands away from the stranger struggling to breathe. She stood and stepped into the middle of the street, both hands raised to stop a car. The first one swerved around her, its horn screaming through the rain. The second slammed on its brakes, and the driver rolled down the window, shouting that she was crazy before driving away. Naomi held her belly and breathed hard, but she did not turn back. When a yellow taxi appeared at the end of the street, she stood fully in front of it. The driver stopped less than an arm's length from her knees, rolled down the window, and looked angry. Naomi pointed toward the alley. He saw Arthur, saw the state he was in, then shook his head again and again, afraid of blood on the seat and insurance trouble. Naomi no longer had time to persuade him with words. She pulled the rent envelope from her coat pocket, the paper already damp at the edges. She opened it, showing the $20 bills under the headlights. It was the rent money, the money that would keep the old crib in the corner under a roof when the baby came. She pushed the whole envelope into the driver's hand and forced his fingers to close around it. She said only one thing, Take him to St. Jude. Money won over the driver's fear faster than compassion did. He opened the back door. Naomi went back and pulled Arthur up. His body was heavy, his clothes soaked, making her hands slip. She had to place her shoulder under his arm and use the full weight of her pregnant body to lift him off the concrete. Arthur woke for one moment when his head lightly hit the car frame. He heard Naomi apologize, even though she had done nothing wrong. He heard the driver complaining about the back seat. He heard the door slam shut, then the taxi rushed into the rain. On the way to St. Jude, Naomi sat in the back seat, pressing a towel against Arthur's side. She kept him leaning toward her so he would not fall forward every time his breath broke. Each time the car hit a pothole, pain tightened through her belly, but she kept her hand in the right place. The driver kept looking in the rearview mirrors, his face tense because he was afraid the man might die in his car. Naomi did not look at him. She looked at Arthur, counting his breaths through the fog on the window. When his breathing grew thin, she leaned closer and told him not to sleep, even though she did not know how much he could still hear. St. Jude glowed white in the rainy night. Naomi almost fell when the emergency doors opened and 2 orderlies pulled a stretcher toward them. She followed them, one hand still on her belly, the other cold and wet from holding Arthur the whole way. At the intake desk, the staff asked for the patient's information, insurance, and emergency contact. Naomi knew nothing except that he was still alive when they put him in the taxi. She handed over her old volunteer card, said she used to help there, and asked them to treat him first and write the details later. The night clerk vaguely recognized her, saw her pregnant belly and the wet shirt shaking under the fluorescent lights, and pushed the file into emergency intake with incomplete information. When the desk asked for a deposit because no insurance could be verified, Naomi took out the loose cash left at the bottom of her bag. She had already given small Billstovit to the taxi driver, but there were still a few small bills she had saved for baby things. She counted them on the counter with cold fingers. 120, a few 10 seconds, and several wrinkled 5 seconds until the cashier looked at her longer than usual. The money was not enough for everything, but it was enough to open the first file. Naomi signed her name in the box for the person who brought the patient in. The letters blurred because her hand was wet, and then she sat down in a plastic chair outside the procedure room. She did not call anyone. There was no one to call. The landlord had posted the final notice on her door that afternoon. If she did not pay $800 in the morning, the lock would be changed. Naomi sat under the hospital lights, her wet t-shirt stuck to her pregnant belly, her hands still marked with dark dried stains around her nails. When a nurse gave her a towel and asked if she needed a pregnancy check, Naomi only shook her head, her eyes on the red light above the procedure area. The baby inside her kicked softly, as if reminding her that another life was waiting out there. She placed a hand on her belly and whispered a silent apology. The procedure lasted until almost 4 a.m. A doctor came out, removed his mask, and said the man had made it past the first danger, but his condition still needed close watching. Naomi nodded and stood up too fast, then had to grab the arm of the chair. The doctor asked what her relationship was to the patient. She looked at the recovery room door, then at the clock on the wall. If she left now, she could still get home before the landlord changed the lock. She shook her head and said she was the only person who found him. The doctor thanked her, but she had already turned to pick up the wet cloth bag under the chair. Arthur woke the next morning with his arm and his side wrapped in bandages. The first person he saw was the doctor on duty. The story came to him in broken pieces. A pregnant woman had brought him in, an old St. Jude card, small cash bills, and a wool coat left over him, and then she had disappeared before dawn. Arthur tried to sit up, but pain pulled him back down. He demanded that they find her immediately. By noon, his people arrived at the hospital and checked cameras, volunteer lists, and intake record. The camera only showed the shape of a pregnant woman with wet hair and her face lowered as she moved down the hallway. The last name in the signature was blurred by water. The doctor said something that kept Arthur silent for a long time. That woman had paid the deposit with small cash bills, then left at 4 a.m. after knowing he would live. No one knew where she went. No one knew if she still had money to get home. Arthur lay in the hospital bed, looking at the old wool coat folded inside a plastic bag near the cabinet, smelling rain, disinfectant, and cheap soap. He sent people to search through the St. Jude system around the South Side rooming houses and at centers that helped pregnant women. For weeks, the results were only wrong addresses, old phone numbers, blurry camera footage, and an incomplete name. What he did not know was that when Naomi got back to her rented room, snow was still mixed with rain. The landlord was already standing in the hallway with a locksmith, holding a blank receipt. Naomi reached into her coat pocket by instinct, then remembered the $800 envelope was in the hands of a stranger driving a taxi somewhere else. The landlord did not ask where she had been, and he did not care that her clothes carried the marks of a chaotic night. He only looked at her pregnant belly, looked at the unpaid room, then set her things out in the hallway. The old crib, a few sets of baby clothes, and a paper bag holding hospital papers were stacked under the dirty yellow light. Naomi stood in front of the door with the new lock, one hand holding her belly and the other holding the wet cloth bag. The pain in her back from the long night and the cold forced her to lean against the wall. Outside, the streets were still slick with icy water. She did not cry right away. She bent down and picked up each of the baby's things, putting them into the bag, covering the tiny clothes with a dry t-shirt to keep them from getting wet. At the hospital, Arthur Whitmore had just begun to keep living. And in the hallway of that cheap rooming house, Naomi Hayes' life had just fallen through the last piece of floor beneath her feet. 1 week before the party, Naomi Hayes woke at 5:12 in the morning to the sharp static coming from Sam's hearing aid. The sound was thin, harsh, and broken, like metal scraping against a live wire, enough to make the boy sit up suddenly with both hands pressed over his right ear. In the second-floor apartment in South Seattle, the window still held cold mist, and the radiator clanked without giving off much heat. Naomi rushed from the mattress beside her son's bed, removed the device from Sam's ear, with fingers still swollen from her night dishwashing shift, and checked the battery even though she already knew the battery was not the problem. Sam watched his mother's mouth to understand her words. The 7-year-old boy was used to the world turning into blocks of distorted sound, sometimes far away, sometimes too close. Naomi sat on the edge of the bed, forced a smile onto her face, and spoke slowly so he could read that it was okay, that she would fix it. Sam nodded obediently, but his small hand still held one side of his head. On the wooden table beside the bed, the audiology quote for a new device lay under a cold cup of water, $3,000, not including the appointment and adjustment fees. Naomi had circled the number with a blue pen, then folded the paper in half every time Sam walked into the kitchen. Her morning began with small calculations so cruel they felt like cuts. The rent was still short to a note of $60. The food card could only cover milk and bread, eggs, and a few cans of soup. Naomi poured the last of the cereal into a bowl for Sam, then poured herself weak black coffee. When Sam pushed the bowl toward her, she shook her head and pretended she had eaten while he was still asleep. The boy looked at her for a few more seconds, then quietly broke his toast in half and placed the smaller piece beside his mother's coffee cup. Naomi took Sam to school on the 124 bus. She always chose the seat near the front door so he could see the driver's lips when he was greeted in the morning. The hearing aid static made Sam wince every time the bus braked hard. Naomi tapped her finger lightly on the back of his hand in a slow rhythm, a signal between the two of them that told Sam she was still there. In front of the school gate, she bent down and fixed the collar of his coat. The boy asked in an uneven voice, it's because he could barely hear himself, if she would be home tonight before he fell asleep. Naomi brushed his hair and promised she would try, then watched him walk into the hallway full of children's shoes and locker doors opening and closing. Right after that, Naomi went to the small office of Sterling and Vale, the event company that assigned her seasonal serving shifts at private parties for rich clients. During the day, she cleaned rooms at a hotel near the airport. The work was not steady, but it paid by shift, and after each long evening, she could put a few more bills into the envelope marked Sam's ears in the kitchen drawer. At the same time, on the 39th floor of the Whitmore Holdings building, Arthur Whitmore sat in a glass conference room with a file in front of him that had nothing to do with the upcoming wedding party. Clara's name appeared on several statement pages, attached to small transfers from the Whitmore Hope Charity Fund to an art consulting company that had no real employees. The legal team had been tracking it for 6 months. They had emails, hotel schedules, lobby footage, backed up messages, and money trails leading to the account of a man Clara had introduced as a media consultant. Arthur read all of it without changing expression. In his hand was a new wedding ring, and on the table was a memo about the breach of marriage clause in the agreement. Clara did not know Arthur knew. She still walked into his office late that afternoon, smelling of white perfume, placing a hand on his shoulder in front of his secretary. She talked about the private dinner after the wedding, the guest list, and how the restaurant needed to be reminded not to let ordinary staff damage the image. Arthur listened, signed an unrelated document, then set down the pen. To Clara, his silence meant she still had control. Naomi's was to the prep shift at the private restaurant on the high floor near the bay. Clara arrived early to inspect the flowers, napkins, chair positions, and lighting for press photos. She walked past the staff as if moving among objects, only stopping when she saw something that ruined her line of sight. Naomi was placing water glasses on a side table when Clara looked down at her old soft-soled shoes, then at the faded cuffs of her uniform. Clara's frown was enough for the manager to write Naomi's name down. During the next 2 days of preparation, Clara kept creating small requests that were as sharp as thorns. Napkins had to be folded again because the edge was not straight. Glasses had to be polished a second time because there was a trace of steam. The flowers on the main table had to be changed to a color that looked less cheap. Each time something was wrong, Clara's eyes often found Naomi, even when the mistake belonged to someone else. She did not need to yell. She used a slow voice, smiled in front of the manager, and let words like unprofessional, below standard, and doesn't fit the space fall close enough for Naomi to hear. Naomi lowered her head and worked. She was used to people who did not need to touch anyone to make them feel dirty. She kept her pay sheet in her pocket and checked her break times now and then so she could call the school about Sam. Each call was short. Sam's hearing aid worked sometimes and failed other times. His teacher said he was sitting closer to the board and trying to read lips more, but yesterday at lunch, the static gave him such a headache that he had to go to the nurse's office. Naomi stood in the tablecloth storage room, one hand covering the phone, the other pressing her nails into her palm so no sob would come out. After the call, she wiped her face with a brown paper towel and went back to the banquet room with a tray of clean glasses. That evening, Arthur arrived later than planned after a legal meeting. He came through the service kitchen entrance to avoid the group of reporters waiting at the main doors. The back hallway of the restaurant was lit by cold fluorescent lights and smelled of frying oil, floor cleaner, and freshly cut bread. Near the food waste bin, he saw a female employee gathering pieces of clean leftover bread from a discard tray, wrapping them in a paper towel and slipping them into her pocket. She moved very quickly, more embarrassed than greedy. Arthur stopped with his hand on the metal door. He only saw half of her face in profile, a white collar, a black apron, and an old plastic badge partly hidden under the strap. A familiar feeling passed through him, too fast to become a memory. Before he could step forward, Clara appeared at the end of the hallway. She looked at the bulge in Naomi's pocket, then at Arthur as if she had just caught something filthy inside her own home. The restaurant manager followed behind her. Clara did not make a scene. She simply ordered that employee to leave through the back door, saying she did not want to see someone collecting trash around the VIP guestie area. Arthur watched Naomi quietly take the pieces of bread out of her pocket, place them back on this discard tray, and lower her head as she went through the back door. The metal door closed, leaving cold wind in the hallway and a nameless hollow space in his chest. That night, Arthur sat in his private car longer than usual before going home. He opened the old St. Jude file photos on his phone again, the shape of a pregnant woman with her face lowered, a blurry plastic badge, and a soaked wool coat. The image was too unclear to compare. He zoomed in until the picture broke into square pixels. Something in Naomi's lowered posture, in the way she avoided the manager's eyes, bothered him like a thread caught inside his collar. But the legal team called, reporting that the Clara file was ready to trigger the clause after the event. Arthur closed the photo. One decision was delayed one more night, and in the world of poor people, one delayed night can sometimes be enough for everything to slip out of their hands. On the morning of the party, Naomi received a message from Sam's teacher while she was folding napkins in the side room. Sam's hearing aid had stopped working completely after reading class. He could not hear the bell between periods, got pushed through the hallway by a group of children, and dropped his books, then sat in the nurse's office with both hands over his ears, even though the device was already turned off. The teacher wrote that Sam tried to say he was okay, but he asked 3 times whether his mother would be mad if he could not hear the lesson. Naomi read the message for the 4th time, her thumb still on the cracked screen, then put the phone away before anyone could see her eyes turning red. That afternoon, Mr. Keller called the entire serving staff into the wine storage room. He repeated the guest list, the price of each bottle of wine, the rules for moving around the main table, and the demand that no one disturb Mrs. Clara Whitmore under any condition. When he reached Naomi, he looked at her longer. He said Clara was already very unhappy about several preparation mistakes, and if Naomi caused even one scratch on the floor that night, the company had the right to make her pay all related costs. The warning was spoken like a procedure, but the other employees went silent. They knew Naomi did not have money to hire a lawyer, did not have a strong enough contract to protect herself, and did not have anyone in the banquet room who would stand with her if Clara pointed a finger. Naomi nodded. She did not ask anything. In her pocket, the envelope marked Sam's ears held only $1,740 after months of extra work. That evening shift, if she received full pay and tips, might help her schedule a temporary repair while applying for assistance for the new device. Her silence had an exact price. It was $3,000. It was her son hearing the teacher clearly after months of static. It was Sam not having to read everyone's lips until his head hurt. It was one morning when he could hear his mother call his name from the kitchen without turning to watch her mouth. Before the shift began, Naomi went into the employee bathroom, locked the last stall, and called Sam through the caption app. She spoke slowly so the words would appear clearly on his screen. Sam answered in short messages with many spelling mistakes, telling her not to worry, that he was only a little tired today. Then he sent one more sentence that made Naomi set the phone down on top of the toilet paper holder. "I will hear again. Right, Mom?" She looked at that line for a long time, wiped her eyes with rough paper, then typed, "Of course he would." Mommy was working on it. Outside, the banquet room was already lit. Clara came in for the final against her body, her satin dress tight against her body, her new ring shining under the lights. Arthur arrived later in a black suit, his face calm, carrying a thin file inside his leather briefcase. Inside was the final legal proposal to handle Clara after the dinner. He planned to wait until the next morning. He did not yet know that the night would not give him the right to wait anymore. Naomi stood at the side entrance with a tray of red wine. Her collar had been pinned to hide the faded fabric. Her hand gripped the tray so tightly that her knuckles turned white. From the banquet room, the laughter of VIP guests rose bright and light, like a sound from another city. Her phone buzzed one more time in her pocket, but she did not dare look. Mr. Keller had just passed by and told her to enter the main room in her assigned position. Clara turned her head toward Naomi, her eyes stopping on the plain uniform as if she had found the final flaw in a perfect picture. Naomi took a breath, swallowed the bitter taste in her throat, and stepped through the doorway carrying the wine tray, the exact $3,000 debt, and all the silence she had to keep so her son could hear the world again. Arthur had barely finished whispering those words when Clara stood still, as if the entire banquet room had just slipped out from under her feet. The wine-colored lipstick on her mouth was still perfect, and the evening gown still held her body in expensive fabric. But the hand she had placed on Arthur's sleeve pulled itself back. The guests around the main table could not hear every word clearly. They only saw Clara's face change very quickly. In rooms of the ultra-rich, people usually understand disaster not from shouting, but from a powerful man suddenly lowering his voice. Naomi sat on the chair near the rug, her hand wrapped in Arthur's silk handkerchief. The restaurant's medical worker was touch her skin, but she could barely feel the gauze touch her skin. Her uniform shirt was still wet with wine, the collar sticking to her collarbone. She did not understand how Arthur knew St. Jude, and she did not understand why Clara looked as if the air had been pulled from her lungs. What Naomi understood most clearly was that Mr. Keller still stood a few steps away with the tablet that had recorded her name under a wage deduction, and at home, Sam still could not hear his mother again. Arthur did not curse at Clara, and he did not turn the moment in a stage show. He only raised his right hand very slightly. But at 4 VIP tables around the room, 6 men and 2 women in black suits stood up almost at the same time. They did not look like guests. None of them held wine glasses. They carried thin folders, small earpieces, and the faces of people who had been waiting for a signal prepared in advance. The piano stopped completely when the lead attorney for Whitmore Holdings stepped near the projection screen at the end of the hall. The screen that had been used to show Arthur and Clara's wedding photos switched to a dark interface, then displayed legal text about an internal file, authorization for disclosure, and evidence of violations of the prenuptial agreement. A few guests immediately looked down at their phones to avoid witnessing it. Clara looked at the screen, then at Arthur, her mouth slightly open but unable to find the right role to play. The first recording played, not loudly but clearly enough for every table to hear. It was Clara's voice in a hotel room, discussing with the man she called a media consultant how to move money from the Whitmore Hope Fund through a fake consulting contract. The foundation name, amount, account code, and transfer time appeared beside it on the screen. Next came the hotel lobby footage, the room booking schedule, account statements, and images of Clara walking arm in arm with that man into a private elevator on an afternoon when Arthur was attending a hospital board hearing. No one in the room needed to hear more to understand. The guests who had laughed with Clara began setting their glasses down very slowly. A woman on the charity board pulled the napkin from her lap and folded it into a square. An older investor turned his head and spoke quietly to the assistant standing behind him. The rejection of the upper class happens cleanly, without noise, without fingerprints. They only move their chairs half an inch away, stop making eye contact, stop smiling, and stop saying the name of the person who has just become a risk. Arthur's lead attorney opened the file and read the notices in a steady voice. The black card account under Clara's name, which had been issued through the Whitmore family line of credit, was frozen immediately. Her right to use the lakeside mansions was suspended under the residency clause after breach. Every request to transfer assets, shares, and jewelry held under the trust was paused. Clara no longer had the right to represent Whitmore Hope at any event. The file about the misuse of charity funds would be sent to the authorities and the independent board. Those words fell across the banquet room like seals stamped onto paper, needing no emotion to make a person lose everything. Arthur still stood in the middle of the hall, both hands resting at his sides. There was no pleasure on his face. A restaurant security employee moved closer to Clara along with a Whitmore legal representative. They did not touch her right away. They spoke very quietly and asked her to leave the event area because the right to use the space had been withdrawn from her name. Clara jerked her hand away and looked at Arthur like she was looking at a wall with no door left in it. The wedding ring on her finger still shone, but it could not open an account, could not open the mansion, and could not open a single look of pity. As Clara was let out, the satin dress dragged across the wool rug still stained with wine. She tried to keep her back straight, but every time a phone flash went off from one of the guests, her shoulders twitched slightly. The man who had appeared in the hotel file was not there to save her. Her wealthy friends kept just enough polite distance to avoid being called cruel, but far enough away not to appear in the same frame. Clara passed close to Naomi, her eyes red more from humiliation than regret. Naomi did not look at her. She looked at the silk handkerchief, now lightly stained red around her hand, and tried to keep her breathing steady. When the hall door closed behind Clara, the room still could not return to normal. The piano did not start again. The servers did not know whether to clear glasses or stand still. Some guests began whispering about legal issues, the foundation's reputation, and whether this would get out. They spoke in the voices of people who wanted to turn public humiliation into a media management problem. But Arthur had already turned away from them. He walked toward Naomi. Naomi immediately tried to stand. Her body was used to not sitting when rich people were standing, but the medical worker lightly held her wrist to finish placing the bandage. Arthur stopped a short distance away, removed the tuxedo jacket from his shoulders, and draped it over Naomi in front of everyone. The expensive wool covered both her shoulders, hiding the wine-wet shirt and the dirty apron. The action made the people around the table look down at their own hands, as if they were realizing for the first time that they had left a woman sitting cold in the room for too long. Arthur spoke to her softly, only loud enough for Naomi to hear. He had been searching for the woman who saved him for 5 years. He owed her a life and a roof over her head. That sentence made a few people in the room breathe out, as if they thought the story had finally found a shape they could accept. The billionaire was saved, the poor benefactor was repaid, and the villain was pulled from the stage. Heads began tilting toward Naomi, waiting for tears, waiting for thanks, waiting for the moment when a poor person was allowed to be moved by a rich person's generosity. Naomi sat very still. Arthur's jacket was warmer than anything she had worn all winter, but its weight made her back tighten. She looked at the faces around the room. These were the same faces that had watched wine run down her collar, watched her hand pick up glass, and heard the manager hold back her evening pay. They had not seen her until Arthur called her his savior. And now they wanted to see her be beautifully grateful, neat, and clean, so their own silence would feel less dirty in memory. She stood slowly, the bandage on her hand pulled tight as she moved. The tuxedo jacket slipped slightly from her shoulders, but she held it with her uninjured hand. Arthur looked at her, and for the first time that night, the certainty on his face cracked. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room was too quiet, and the people used to being served finally had to listen to the server speak. She returned the jacket to Arthur. Her voice was small, but from beside the wine cabinet. She had saved a human being lying in the street. She had not saved him so that 5 years later, his wife could turn her dignity into entertainment. The sentence had no harshness in it. That was exactly why it went straighter than any scream. It hit Arthur first, then moved through the rest of the room like a bill being pushed across a table, asking each person to read their own name on it. Arthur accepted the jacket with both hands. He could order money transferred immediately. He could give Naomi a check large enough to buy Sam's hearing aid, pay the rent, clear the debt, and change her life. But in the moment she placed the jacket in his hands, Arthur understood that money given at the wrong time could feel like another way to silence the person who had just been humiliated. He had used the law to crush Clara, but what Naomi was demanding back did not live inside any contract. It was the right to be seen as a human being before being called a savior. Naomi bent down and picked up her silver tray, not because she was going to keep serving, but because she had the habit of not leaving things scattered on the floor. That small gesture made a female guest nearby lift a hand to cover her mouth. Naomi placed the tray on a side table, removed the name tag from her apron, and set it beside the tray. Mr. Keller opened his mouth as if he meant to mention her shift, but Arthur turned his head and looked at him. This time the man took a full step back. Naomi walked toward the main exit where Clara had just been let out. She was still someone who knew where the back door was, which hallway belonged to staff, where the trash bins were, and where the floor stayed wet. Each step she took left a faint trail of wine and water on the rug. The wealthy people in the room watched her, waiting for Arthur to stop her. He did not. He stood still with the jacket in his hands, like a man who had just received a debt larger than anything written in his books. Naomi went through the service kitchen hallway where fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. A young employee moved aside, eyes red, but did not dare say anything. In that moment, Naomi felt her phone buzz in her pocket. She took it out and looked at the cracked screen. A captioned message from Sam's teacher appeared, saying the boy had taken off the broken hearing aid because of a headache and was asking when his mother would come home. Naomi stood in the smell of floor cleaner and old bread, her bandaged finger touching the screen. She had just left a room that could have given her every amount of money in the world, but she still did not know how she would buy sound for her son in the morning. See, inside the banquet hall, Arthur finally followed. He did not run and did not call her name in front of the others. He signaled for the lead attorney to come with him by tilting his head. The legal team leader immediately understood that the real fight was no longer with Clara. It was how to return to Naomi the things that could not be written into one simple check. Arthur passed Mr. Keller and stopped long enough to say Naomi's wages had to be paid in full that night, along with every medical cost and a dignity settlement from the restaurant. Mr. Keller nodded again and again, his face as white as the tablecloth. But when Arthur reached the back hallway, Naomi was already standing near the emergency exit, her cold shirt stuck to her back, one hand holding her phone. She turned and looked at him before he could speak. Her eyes were no longer the eyes of a server in front of VIP guests. They were the eyes of the mother who had lost $800 of rent money to save him 5 years earlier, then lost another night's pays because of his wife tonight. Arthur stopped a few steps away from her. All his power was behind him, in the room full of lawyers, evidence, and people now afraid of his name. In front of him was the woman who had just proved that respect could not be purchased with gratitude. Naomi opened the emergency exit. Cold wind from the back stairwell blew in and made the hem of her uniform shake. Arthur looked at her bandaged hand on the metal push bar. He wanted to say Sam's name, wanted to ask what she needed, and wanted to fix everything that very night. But he understood too late that someone once left slushed out in the snow did not need a savior stepping out of a banquet room. She needed a person who knew how to stand at the right distance. Naomi stepped through the door, leaving behind the restaurant's warm yellow lights, the designer jacket in Arthur's hands, and a question that no lawyer in the Whitmore Empire could answer for him. How do you return dignity to a woman who has just refused everything you thought you could give? Naomi got back to the apartment building at 3:08 in the morning after 2 bus rides through the cold rain. The outdoor stairs were slick with standing water, and the light on the second floor flickered as if it was about to go out completely. Her serving uniform still smelled like red wine and floor cleaner. The bandaged hand throbbed every time she held the railing. She had walked out of a room that could have given her a check larger than every debt she owed, but in her pocket she had only a cracked phone, a bus card, and the savings envelope for Sam. The apartment door opened before she could put the key in. Sam stood behind the gap, barefoot on the cold wooden floor, his pajamas wrinkled, his hair sticking up on one side. He was not wearing the hearing aid anymore. Sam looked at his mother's mouth and understood very little, then threw his arms around her waist. The sound he made was only a broken, unclear murmur, but Naomi knew he was asking if she was okay. She closed the door with her elbow, knelt down, and held him tightly, trying to keep her shoulders from shaking. But when Sam pressed his cheek against her neck and his small hand found the bandage in her palm, Naomi could not hold it in anymore. She cried in the narrow kitchen, beside the leaking sink and the wooden table with chip paint on one corner. Sam could not hear his mother's crying clearly, but he felt it through her breathing and the way she held him for too long. The boy lifted the hearing aid as if he wanted to apologize because it was broken. That small gesture made Naomi sink all the way to the floor, one arm around her son, one hand covering her mouth. She had just turned away from the chance to receive money from the most powerful man in the city. Because if she accepted it like a reward in front of the people who had silently watched her be humiliated, she was afraid Sam would grow up believing his mother's dignity had a price tag. The rest of the night had almost no sleep in it. Naomi wiped Sam down with a warm towel, laid him back in bed, then sat at the kitchen table and checked every bill. She wrote $3,000 on the back of the envelope, crossed it out, then wrote a smaller number after subtracting the savings. Sam slept in short, broken stretches, sometimes turning his head as if searching for a familiar sound that no longer reached him. Naomi watched him until morning, her white bandaged hand resting on the table, her fingertips still smelling like the restaurant's antiseptic. At 8:17, someone knocked on the door. It was not hard or rushed, only 3 even knocks. Naomi looked through the peephole, ready to see the landlord or a company manager, asking her to sign a penalty notice. But in the hallway stood Arthur Whitmore, with no tuxedo, no guards, and no camera flashes. He wore a gray sweater under a long charcoal coat, his hair still damp from the morning rain. Beside him was an older man with thin-framed glasses carrying a black medical equipment case. Behind them, there was no loud line of cars, only a driver standing far below at the bottom of the stairs. Naomi opened the door, but she did not step back to invite them in right away. The apartment behind her was too small and too real. The thin blanket on the sofa, the unwashed cereal bowl, the folded electric bill. Arthur introduced the man with him as an audiologist from the Central Children's Hospital. Naomi immediately looked towards Sam's bed. The boy had already sat up, hugging a pillow, watching the adults with careful eyes. Arthur did not talk about last night in front of Sam. He stood at the doorway and waited for Naomi to decide. That waiting was what made her open the door wider. The doctor stepped in first, removed his shoes out of politeness when he saw the freshly wiped floor, then sat down at Sam's level. He opened the equipment case and took out a small digital hearing aid, much smaller than the old one, along with a tablet for adjustment. Naomi sat close beside her son, one hand behind his back, her bandaged hand trying to stay still on her knee. The exam lasted almost a minute. The doctor used picture cards, a small light, and simple response tests to measure how much hearing Sam still had. He explained everything slowly and let Naomi read every number on the screen. There was no rush charity. Every step felt like a real medical appointment with consent papers, device warranty, follow-up scheduling, and a school support plan. Arthur stood near the kitchen door, both hands folded in front of him, so quiet that Sam forgot several times that he was there. Naomi still did not know whether she should feel thankful or cautious, because too many years of struggle had taught her that every large, kind act might carry a hidden cost. Sam looked up, waiting for his mother's reaction before daring to smile fully in that morning light. When the doctor placed the new device in Sam's ear and began adjusting it, the apartment seemed to shrink around the kitchen table. Naomi held her breath without realizing it. The doctor set the starting volume very low, then tapped lightly on the table. Sam blinked. The doctor said a few simple words, slowly and clearly. Sam turned his head toward the sound. Naomi lifted a hand to her mouth. After months of static and twisted sound, the boy looked around as if the old apartment had just gained another window. The radiator clanking, the water dripping at the sink, the bus outside on the street, all of it came back to him layer by layer. Naomi leaned close to her son. She said Sam's name very softly, as if she feared the sound might break the moment if it were too strong. Sam turned sharply toward her. This time he did not look at her mouth first. He heard her. His eyes opened wide, then a smile broke across his thin little face. He laughed out loud, the sound so clear and unfamiliar that Naomi had to hold the edge of the table. Sam touched his ear, then touched his mother's lips, then wrapped his arms around her neck. Naomi cried into his hair without covering her mouth anymore. She let her crying mix with Sam's laughter, with the doctor gently adjusting the settings, and with Arthur turning his face toward the window so his own gaze would not take over the moment. After Sam became busy listening to the doctor test different sounds, Arthur placed a thin folder on the kitchen table. There was no check, no envelope of cash. On the cover was the name of a trust created for Samuel Hayes, along with documents transferring full ownership of the apartment building into that trust. Arthur had bought the building from the owner during the night, paid the overdue taxes and repair debts, and then transferred control to an independent management group with terms stating that Naomi and Sam could stay permanently, with no rent increase and no eviction for any old debt. The other tenants in the building would also keep stable leases for 5 years, with a required repair fund for the heating, pipes, and fire escape. Naomi read each page more slowly than the doctor had read the numbers. She stopped at Sam's name, then at the line about long-term residency. Arthur did not stand too close or rush her. He told the truth in a low voice. He had spent 5 years looking for her, but that did not make her 5 years any less cold. He had not come to buy forgiveness, but to repair what could be repaired with responsibility. The second folder was an offer for her to become operations director for the Whitmore Hope Charity Clinic Network, with hiring power, a transparent budget, and a seat on the oversight board. The job was not being given because she was pitiful. It was being offered because she understood waiting rooms, forms, bus money, shame at payment counters, and the things rich people often missed when they talked about compassion. Naomi set the folder down. She looked at Arthur for a long time, as if trying to see whether the man in front of her was still the guest from the banquet room or the man who had once lain in the rainy alley. She did not hug him. She did not thank him right away. She asked if the other tenants would be moved out so the building could become a beautiful project for the press. Arthur handed her another signed attachment, clearly stating an anti-redevelopment clause for 10 years unless the residents agreed. Naomi read it, then her eyes stopped on his hand resting on the edge of the chair, where there was no impatience. Only then did she give a very small nod. In the months that followed, change came through and new habits, not through a pericles in numbis, not through a miracle in one night. Sam went to the audiology clinic every week, relearning how to tell the difference between sounds near and far, his teacher's voice from the end of the classroom, and his mother opening the door after work. He still had tired days and still removed the device when his head felt overloaded, but he no longer sat alone in the nurse's office trying to guess the world through glass. Naomi began working at Whitmore Hope in low shoes and with a thick notebook, changing small procedures one by one, shorter forms, easier access to interpreters, a bus fund right at the front desk, and a rule that staff could not ask questions that made poor people feel ashamed in front of their children. Arthur kept the distance she asked for. He did not turn her into a promotional story during the first week, did not let reporters photograph Sam, and did not mention the St. Jude night at fundraisers. Slowly, Naomi saw that a real apology was not just one sentence or one gift. It was a person with power choosing to change the structure so that weaker people did not have to kneel and beg every time. One afternoon, when she walked through the clinic hallway and saw a young mother receive a bus voucher without having to explain why she was poor, Naomi stopped for a few seconds. Then she kept walking like someone who had finally found a way to turn old pain into an exit door for someone else. Clara disappeared from red carpet parties. A few months later, a former restaurant employee saw her in a blue uniform at a fast food store off the highway, wearing rubber gloves and wiping a sink while a shift manager hurried her along. No one needed to. A real fall sometimes has no music. It only has fluorescent lights, the smell of frying oil, and a person who once looked down on labor now learning that floors do not clean themselves. You know, when I think back to the moment Clara broke down in front of that projection screen, I don't feel the kind of satisfaction you get from watching an action movie. I only feel a very real kind of irony. In a world obsessed with $1,000 handbags, red carpet dinner tables, and smiles practiced in front of a mirror, people can easily mistake wealth for human hire. Clara thought stepping on a server's shirt would make her stand higher. But every insult she threw down only showed how poor she was inside. Naomi was different. She didn't have a large bank account, a powerful last name, or anyone standing behind her in that banquet room. But 5 years earlier, when a stranger was lying in a cold alley, she used all of her rent money to keep him alive. She did not know he was a billionaire. She only saw a human being who could not wait any longer. The compassion of people who have been at the bottom is often steady. They give not because they have extra, but because they understand how painful it is to be left behind. I don't remember Arthur freezing Clara's accounts the most. I don't remember the lawyers in suits standing up in the middle of the banquet room. What I remember is Naomi returning the designer coat. She reminded everyone that a check can pay a bill, but it cannot give back dignity on its own. Real repayment is not throwing money at pain and hoping it disappears. Real repayment is listening to what the wounded person needs and fixing the doors that once closed in front of them. If Naomi's story made you pause for a moment, leave a comment with the phrase, "Justice forgets no one," not to celebrate Clara's fall, but to remind each other that there are still a lot of Naomis living in silence and a lot of Sams in need of a sympathetic adult who will listen to them. And if you want to walk with stories about kindness, dignity, and justice that may be late, but never goes away, please like this video and subscribe to Single Mom Billionaire Story. I'll see you in the next story where one small act today may become the miracle that saves someone's life tomorrow.